So we looked last lecture at the general picture of Venice and looked at the careers of Bellini and Giorgione. And now we turn to Titian. Titian is called the Prince of Artists of the Renaissance for a number of reasons. For one thing, he was a very prosperous artist. He did well. He had a business, had a lumber business that he made a lot of money with, and so he wasn't entirely dependent on making money through selling his paintings. So that helped to kind of separate him from the stigma that artists face of getting paid for their work. And that payment for their work made it so that they were equated with um, what manual laborers did. So, like bricklayers being paid for their work, and instead of it being seen as this noble intellectual pursuit. Speaking of nobility, Titian is actually made a nobleman officially by one of his great patrons, Charles V, the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor from the Habsburg family that we'll be talking about most of next week. But Titian is also so famous because of the great beauty, just the aesthetic beauty of his work. And he was a good businessman with his painting as well, in that he really understood well what his clients wanted, and he was careful to deliver it. And his style does not change really dramatically until later in his career, because he really finds his niche with these beautiful idealized figures. He is a master of the oil pigment and has these gorgeous luminous paintings with rich colors. He has more naturalism than Giovanni Bellini does, in that, the people that he includes in his paintings are more believable as people that you would see walking around on the streets of Venice. Whereas Bellini's are so idealized that they're just a little too perfect and lack that sense of reality. Here we see the so-called Gypsy Madonna, just to show you that Titian, like Bellini, made these sorts of private devotional paintings. There was such a good market for them, a real need for them for Venetian residences, and he certainly filled that void that happens after Bellini's death, and produces a great number of these sorts of images that are clearly coming from that same Byzantine tradition that we saw already. Just to show you the similarities and differences, obviously both Bellini and Titian use the fabric, they use the element of landscape, they've reversed the placement of those here. But especially as you look at the figures, I think you can really see what I mean about that greater sense of realism with these figures, that the facial types are much more believable than this kind of absolute geometric perfection of Bellini's. He certainly does well making altarpieces for the churches of Venice and even beyond Venice. He becomes internationally renowned and has clients all over that seek out his work. And in fact, Titian's popularity is an important factor in the careers of Baroque artists like Rubens and Van Dyck and others who, you know, aren't even working in Italy for the great majority of their career, but they know his work. The major collections of Europe include works by Titian. Velázquez is influenced by Titian. All of these great Baroque artists are influenced by Titian, whether or not they make it to Italy and see these altarpieces. There were so many in the great private collections of the ruling families of Europe that were passed down from generation to generation, so from Titian's patrons on down, and they remained highly collectible through the 17th century. This altarpiece is the so-called Madonna of Ca' Pesaro, which means the Madonna of the House of Pesaro. It was commissioned by Jacopo Pesaro, who was a high-ranking member of the church's military. In this altarpiece, we see that Titian has really considered the viewpoint of the worshiper as he processes towards the high altar. In particular, by using this completely new format, which moves away from the pyramid, and instead of having the Madonna and Child at the center point of the composition, as would ordinarily be the case, Titian puts everything on an angle, and we can see this strong diagonal line that is formed in the composition. Everything is still stabilized. You have then a line that moves down this way and then across, so you still have this triangular composition. It's just formed differently. The way that the viewer's viewpoint is taken into consideration is that this altarpiece was on the left-hand side of the church, and so the viewer coming at it from the side would naturally see the Virgin and Child first, and you can see they're more strongly lit as well, which would have brought the eye to them directly, especially within, the dark lighting of the church. So this altarpiece is in the church of Santa Maria de' Frari. So it's a Franciscan church. In fact, it's the largest Franciscan church in Venice. And in this altarpiece, this was commissioned by the Pesaro family, and patrons would pay for works of art for altarpieces, especially if there was a plan for there to be burials that took place in and around the altar space. But people would also, people would do it for a few reasons. For one thing, certainly it was a question of status. They could show off what artists they were able to afford to have to get to do their altarpiece, and the number of figures inside of the altarpiece usually meant a higher price was paid, as artists were often paid by the figure. The size of the altarpiece or the luxury of the materials used would also display the wealth of the family. But there's more to it than that. These were considerable acts of piety. The idea that you use some of your personal money to beautify the church and to provide an altarpiece that glorifies the Virgin and Child was seen as a considerable show of devotion, of Christian piety. And it also served another important purpose, which was that people would pray to these altarpieces, and in so doing would be sort of analogously praying for the souls of the Pesaro family members that had passed on, because this altarpiece was paid for by the family. And this was of considerable concern, because the idea was that the more prayers people said for your soul, the less time you would spend in purgatory and more quickly make your ascent to heaven. So that's one of the main reasons for patronage of altarpieces and of tomb chapels and sculptures for churches and so forth that we see throughout the Renaissance period, and certainly well into the Baroque period. This was commissioned by Jacopo Pesaro, And Jacopo we see here, and he is kneeling in front of the Virgin and Child. There's this intermediary figure of St. Peter, and we know it's St. Peter. He's often shown with yellow and with the key, and the key represents the fact that Christ had given Peter the keys of the church, the leadership of the church, and Peter represents the papacy. We see the papacy here in other ways. There is a flag, as you can see, that's held by this soldier. And we have the papal coat of arms on the flag, joined together with the coat of arms of the Pesaro family. There's a little olive branch here at the top, which is both symbolic of peace and of victory. And that's a major sub-theme of this altarpiece. Jacopo Pesaro had been the admiral of the papal fleets and had had a significant victory over the Turks. And so this was really viewed as a major Christian victory over Islam. And we see this turbaned figure here who's meant to represent Islam and the Turks in particular. So Jacopo kneels down here in front of this prisoner of war, this Turk, and then you have this soldier here, and this soldier is probably a saint. It's probably Saint George, who is the patron saint of soldiers, and that would certainly make sense here. So this important role of the papacy and the naval battles and other battles that the papacy was embroiled in is an important part of this. You can see that this line is made from Jacopo to Peter to the Virgin and Child. And beyond them, the Christ child actually turns towards this saint, and this is Saint Francis, to whom the church is, as a Franciscan church, this is the Church of Saint Francis. And so that's certainly important. In fact, the whole title of the church, the dedication of the church, is Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari, so the glorious Virgin Mary of the Franciscans. And so that certainly makes sense that we would see this important connection between Mary and St. Francis here. This is St. Anthony of Padua, who is also a Franciscan saint and one of particular importance in the Veneto region, since Padua is just, it's the next city over really from Venice. Down here we have members of the Pesaro family, older and younger members of the family, and we have the youngest member looking out at the viewer directly and engages the viewer and helps lead the viewer into the altarpiece, and certainly is meant to represent the continuation of this family dynasty, and of their continued faith and important role in the Catholic Church. This altarpiece is enormously influential for later artists, some of whom we'll be talking about. Correggio is one, and Baroque artists like the Carracci that we'll talk about in week 4 are particularly influenced by Titian's altarpieces in general, but especially of this innovative compositional organization that we see here in this altarpiece. Just so you can see, it's just beautifully done. He's such a masterful painter. Titian's main concerns, and this is an important point, are color and the real beauty of the form that can be achieved through the brushwork, the application of oil paint. Titian and most Venetian artists really were not concerned about doing preliminary drawings, or like Florentine artists would do hundreds of drawings in preparation for then painting on a panel or canvas. And Venetian artists really didn't do that. For one thing, since they're so good at oil paints, they don't really need to, and that you can make changes as you go along, um, because you can paint over the oil and erase any mistakes that you make. And in fact, we know in this painting in particular that the columns were added a bit later, that Titian sort of did them as an afterthought, changing his mind about the way the composition looked, perhaps even once it was in place. Though some art historians actually argue that it may have been another artist that put those columns in instead of Titian. We can see these changes that are made. They're not immediately visible to the eye, but you can do what's called an X-radiograph and see the various levels of the painting through using this technology. This idea of color is one that becomes associated with the civic identity of Venice, and it's in contradistinction to line and drawing, which becomes associated with the Florentine identity. And we'll talk about that more, but it's the basis of one of these chief comparisons in art, and these were major intellectual discussions that not only artists were involved in, but also scholars. But we'll talk about that more next week. So this is the Church of the Frati, and in fact you can see Titian's altarpiece that we just looked at is over here on the left side. And I think even in this image you can see what I mean by that, the viewer approaching the, as the viewer is going towards the high altar, would see this painting on the left. And Titian has really taken that into consideration. But before he did the Pesaro altarpiece, Titian did the altarpiece of the high altar. And you can really see how Titian is thinking about viewpoints and the worshippers' approach to the altar, the viewpoints that you have through these architectural elements that are inside of the church. You can see that the Frati is a Gothic church, and you can tell that from the pointed arches, among other things. And in fact, it's a church that was built in the 13th century. And there are other elements in here that were added on later, but certainly were there by the time Titian was working. And one of those is the choir screen, and that's what this element is here. The choir screen was meant to block the view so that lay people couldn't see directly the Mass as it was taking place. In fact, there was a gate here that would close off the viewers from being able to see what was going on at the high altar. That, lay people just didn't have that kind of access and privilege of seeing the miracle of transubstantiation take place. Transubstantiation is when the body of, when the bread of the Eucharist actually becomes the body of Christ in the moment of the liturgy. And so not everybody could see that. So these choir screens blocked off that kind of accessibility of vision. But what you could see is that the gate, since the gate came down here, the gate, even when it was closed, would offer the ability to see Titian's altarpiece beyond. And in fact, the choir screen ends up perfectly framing the altarpiece depending on your viewpoint of it. As you get closer to the altarpiece, you can see it's quite a large altarpiece. And Titian has considered how having these windows surrounding the altarpiece affects how you see the painting itself and the lighting within the painting. And we'll see that more as we get closer up to it. You can see that Titian has considered that having all of this kind of backlighting around the altarpiece will make it so that the figures could appear sort of obscured. And so he puts this beautiful yellow heavenly light around the most important figures to see, which is the Virgin as she ascends into heaven. We see God the Father welcoming her with these angels as she is bodily assumed into heaven. The Virgin didn't die technically, she fell into a permanent sleep, and her whole body was taken up to heaven, and that is what we see taking place here. She is standing on this cloud formation that's supported by this whole chorus of angels. You can see that they go on in infinity. That cloud formation delineates her and God the Father, this whole heavenly sphere, from these figures that are down here. These guys are quite dark, actually, and the patrons initially were not very happy with this. They felt like it was too difficult to see them. But Titian's plan was that, having these figures in darkness suggests that they are still on earth, while we have this real distinction with what heaven looks like and that heavenly light and the divinity of the figures in heaven. These guys are the apostles who are witnessing this miracle of the Virgin's Assumption. And, some of them have their back turned to us. As I said, some of them are in darkness. Um, the patrons were not completely satisfied with how this was handled. But I get what Titian was going for, and I think it is a really effective way to make this distinction clear and communicate the miracle of this event and kind of recreate for the viewer the vision that these apostles are experiencing. Let's see her in this beautiful light. Again, Titian so concerned about color and light, and it's these sort of natural or even supernatural light effects. It's really just done masterfully here. We'll see more next week how Titian was working for patrons all over the place, but at least for this week, I wanted to show you one or two paintings, at least two, that he did for patrons outside of Venice. This painting of Bacchus and Ariadne was done for a major collector and important prince of Italy, Alfonso d'Este. D'Este's family were the Dukes of Ferrara, a city in northern Italy, not very far from Venice, further south than Venice though. And Alfonso d'Este had this great collection of antiquities and set up a room where he wanted to put his ancient sculptures and other kinds of objects along with paintings. And these are kind of small spaces that we see evolve from kind of the late 15th century and throughout the 16th century. These small spaces are called studiolo, or studioli for plural. Studiolo is Studiolo. And it really means a small study. These are small spaces filled with all kinds of objects for study, or they'll be filled with the art collections, the great treasures of the family, as a place to serve as a kind of reprieve, or a place to go and be in solitude and surrounded by the beautiful things you own, and give you a sense of peace and inspire you and all of that sort of thing. And especially in this case, Alfonso d'Este's studiolo was filled with, art that was mythological in nature, and so the sculptures that were ancient and were of mythological themes were then paired with modern paintings that Alfonso d'Este commissioned from Titian and other artists, including Giovanni Bellini. Titian's painting here is so beautiful. It's in the National Gallery of Art in London, and it is just spectacular. The blues are incredible, and I think even in this digital image, you can really get a sense of that. What's going on here is that Bacchus has gotten his first glance of Ariadne, and he's so filled with love and desire for her that he springs from his chariot and starts to advance towards her. You can see his chariot here, wheel here, is pulled by two cheetahs. Right? Bacchus is the god of wine, and there's always usually a party going on with Bacchus, as you can see from looking at these figures that are following him here. Anyway, he's leaping off of his chariot, and you see this big swoosh of movement. That drapery is just spectacular as he comes off of his chariot and advances towards her. Ariadne had been abandoned on the Greek island of Naxos by Theseus, and you can see there's a ship in the distance, and that is or we're meant to understand, we think, Theseus's ship. And so we see in looking at Ariadne that she initially looks terrified, as rightly so, no? But what Bacchus does, instead of taking her against her will, is raising her to heaven and turning her into a constellation that he can always admire. And we see her already, she's turning, but her hand gesture helps indicate us towards this area. And if we follow up, we'll see the constellation above that he turns her into. The other figures that we see here that are important to point out, especially this guy. This is a figure who is he's completely encircled by a snake. And this is most definitely a reference to that ancient sculpture of Laocoon. And I mentioned to you just a moment ago about this idea of color versus line as being this comparison that is much discussed. But another major discussion that's happening in artistic and intellectual circles is the superiority of painting versus sculpture. So painters naturally argue that their craft is superior, and sculptors do the same. There are a number of arguments that they use to promote their side, and Titian is certainly thinking about those arguments in the depiction of this figure of Laocoon. Painters argue that their artistic process and materials is much cleaner than that of sculptors, and thus being cleaner, they can dress as noblemen even while they paint, and they'll be fine instead of having to dress so roughly and get all dirty as sculptors do, which would debase in their mind what the artist looks like and what he is doing. It makes it less noble as a result. But painters also argue that color is such an appeal for the eye that makes it superior. They argue that being able to include landscape and lots of information about setting is superior to what sculptors can do, especially sculptors of three-dimensional sculpture in the round as opposed to reliefs. So, this sense of color, the kind of modeling of these three-dimensional figures, they argue, they can do that just as well as sculptors can. but they can give you even more. You have more figures included, more information about the landscape. You can include more symbols. All of sorry, all of that making it better than sculpture. Sculptors argue that painting is much easier, that you can make changes, especially if you're using oil paints, whereas in sculpture, you cannot make any mistakes. If you wield that chisel wrong towards the stone you're working on, there's no way that you can correct that. If you mess up the mold that you're using for a bronze casting, there's no way you can correct that. You just have to start all over, so that it requires much more technical expertise than what painting does. They also argue that since you can make figures that are life size or even more, and they can be walked around and interacted with like, human beings, that it makes it so that, it's more realistic, and it allows for more interaction with the figure than painting does, and so that makes it better. Anyway, these are just sort of a tasting of the different sorts of arguments. This idea of comparing two things, painting and sculpture, and color and line, and also kind of related to the color and line argument, Venice versus Florence, are, as I've said, arguments that are being had in these intellectual circles. So not just by artists, but they're being written about and discussed in scientific circles, these academies of learning that are popping up all over Italy. And this is an extraordinary point because it shows us that art is now being elevated to such an extent in society that it's seen as something worthy of intellectual discussion. So that's a major achievement in the status of art and of artist in the 16th century. These comparisons, the word that we use to describe them is paragone, 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 which really just means comparison in Italian, but we use it to describe these specific arguments of comparison that are happening in the 16th century. So Titian's inclusion here of Laocoon, since it's of a sculpture, Titian is able to show what you can do with painting that you can't do with sculpture, such as giving the body color, making the flesh look flesh colored, giving greater dynamism to the figure, putting the figure in a context so that you have this landscape that it's set in. You see it alongside other figures that help you understand the story. And so that's really what Laocoon is doing here so prominently. And of course, since this was going to be in a room with these sculptures from antiquity, it's only natural that these comparisons would make sense to take place in this space where paintings and sculptures are being compared in a pretty immediate way. One thing I didn't mention to you, but should have, is that this room that Alfonso d'Este creates is a studiolo, as I said, but it has a special name, which is how it's described in your textbook. Um, Not particularly important for me that you remember it, but it's called the Camerino d'Alabastro, the little room of alabaster, which refers to the alabaster panes that were in the windows, and probably refers to the material of some of the sculptures that were in this space. Just a gorgeous painting. Those colors are incredible. They really are. I would urge you to go to the National Gallery of London's website, and they have a page on all of the objects that they own, but you can really zoom into the picture. It's a beautiful high-resolution image if you are interested in looking at this painting more closely. This is a painting that Bellini did for the same room. And, in thinking about these comparisons, and especially how there is yet another area of comparison of Venice versus Florence, clearly Alfonso d'Este wanted to make that clear in this space as well, because he has Bellini and Titian do work. He has Dosso Dossi, a local artist from Ferrara, do a painting. And then he tries to get paintings by Raphael and Michelangelo for this space, to no avail, but he tried. And clearly he wanted to be able to have this comparison between Ferrarese and Venetian and Central Italian painting be part of what he was doing in this space. This is a lovely little painting. This is actually in our National Gallery, the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And we see the gods are here. They seem to be taking a rest, and we see, in fact, that they are watching, kind of creepily, as this poor sleeping nymph here is getting ready to be seduced. I think it's a really, really kind way of putting it by this guy here. Anyway, it's a beautiful painting, and again shows the natural sort of interest of Venetian artists of landscape and of color. It's really just spectacular. Beautiful, beautiful painting. We think that Titian was probably involved in this painting as well, and especially may have done some of the landscape elements that we see in this painting. Some of the figures are clearly by Bellini and look, exactly the way we would expect with these perfect geometrical shapes as we saw in those paintings of the Virgin and Child earlier. And that brings us to another great work by Titian, the Venus of Urbino, the topic of your discussion this week. The Venus of Urbino is kind of a misnomer in that she may not be Venus, as you'll read about. She may, in fact, represent marriage or love. She may just be an allegorical figure. And she was not called Venus in her day. She was just called a nude woman. And she fits into that tradition that we saw with Giorgione's Sleeping Venus of the nude reclining female. And while Giorgione had put his figure in a landscape, here Titian's figure is put in a domestic space. We see a curtain behind her. She's reclining on a bed. We see the sheets around the bed and the red fabric over the mattresses below. We see the tile floor. There are tapestries hanging on the wall. And there are these chests that are called cassone, marriage chest. And we have two maidservants who are busy, presumably getting out clothing for the young woman to wear. It looks like there's a dress slung over this woman's shoulder. So either getting ready to dress her or putting away her clothes. Probably getting ready to dress her, though. In the background, we can see that there's a window. There's a little plant sitting on the window, and you can see some landscape elements beyond. I won't spend too much time on this since you're going to read what I view as one of the most interesting articles ever written on this painting, the essay that was done by Rona Goffin. And she'll talk about the marriage symbolism in this work and talk about the gesture of the woman and what that might mean. This painting, I think, as Rona argues, has been really misread since Manet did his image of Olympia. If you're familiar with it, if not, you should probably look it up. But Manet's Olympia was clearly based on what Titian does here, but Manet is working in the 19th century in France, and so quite a bit removed from the context that we're looking at here. But he takes that as a sort of point of inspiration and makes it a commentary about 19th century French culture. It's a prostitute that we see. She's got her maidservant beside her. There is a cat on the bed that is, hissing and all freaked out. So the tone of it is quite different. Since Olympia, the subject of Manet's painting, was a really well-known prostitute, it's understood as, this image of prostitution. And as a result, people, scholars included, have gone back and looked at Titian and thought that the same thing was true here, that she's a prostitute, and she's looking at the viewer, who could be any man, and is trying to seduce them. But as I think Goffin really effectively argues, that can't possibly be the case here. There are certain symbols in here, like the flowers that we see her holding, the colors of the flowers, the sleeping dog, which is a symbol of fidelity, Fido. The name we often give dogs comes from the idea, the word fidelity, Fido, and it really connects with that idea of the loyal dog. But the dog is sleeping here because he is unafraid. He's not alarmed by what is getting ready to take place here, which we understand is the lovemaking between a young bride and her husband, not a prostitute and whatever John came to see her that day. So I'll let Rhoda Goffin explain all of this symbolism to you more effectively than I will here. The other article you're going to be reading is by Jackie Musacchio, and it too describes, not directly about the Venus of Urbino, but talks about ideas about fertility in the Renaissance and how we see those ideas represented in the way women are depicted, children are depicted, and in the kinds of objects that have survived from the Renaissance period. So I'll let them do a better job of that than I do. But what we can see here certainly is Titian's beautiful modeling of the female form. She's just gorgeous. And if you look at, say, how he's used the highlighting of her hair, just makes these beautiful, shiny areas. We get these beautiful textural contrasts between the sheets and the mattress, the velvet of the curtain behind her, and then, all of the lighting that's so beautifully done here in the background. It is truly a beautiful, beautiful painting. But I'll end with that here, and I will pick up back to Florence after this. Thanks.